sort of return to some of those ideas of being the microbial world that we live in, the balance that we have with it, and how we can hurt ourselves by going too far in trying to eliminate pathogens when it's really the world that we've evolved to live in.
Fear of a microbial planet, how germophobic safety culture makes us less safe. We've witnessed a tremendous politicization of science and medicine in the past 2 years. We've thrown out some old paradigms and adopted new ones to drive certain narratives through the pandemic response. We live in a safetyism culture which encourages much of this behavior. This has developed over recent years. But does this behavior at an individual and societal level leave us exposed to greater fragility? These are some of the questions that we'll be addressing today with Steve Templeton, Associate Professor of Microbiology and Immunology at Indiana University School of Medicine. He specializes in experimental models of immunology and infectious disease. He's the author of a forthcoming book, The Fear of a Microbial Planet, and he has a blog right now on Substack by the same name. Today, we're going to be unpacking a lot of the issues that we've witnessed over the last couple of years and also inquiring why it's important that we change course off the back of what we've witnessed the last couple of years if we are to move away from this culture of safetyism and actually protect our immune systems at a deeper level. So, Steve, it's great to have you with us here today.
Yeah, great to be with you.
So let's start with your personal journey. The role of community has been important to you, as outlined in your blog, recently posted A Need for Human Community. You're a man of science. You understand the risks associated with the transmission of diseases. Could you give us a synopsis of your experiences and what you see as the drivers for what appears to be irrational behavior over the past couple of years?
Yeah, I mean, it started with personal experience. Of course, everybody has their own version of how the pandemic hit them and when it hit them, and what they saw as kind of their own biggest fear. And reading what was happening in China and then in Italy, it was clear that there was some very specific, age stratified targets of the virus, and that others might get the virus, but it might be less virulent for those who weren't in the high-risk categories. And then it also was pretty obvious that this is a pretty contagious virus that's going to be very, very difficult to stop. And the way that people began to react to me, I was really concerned about the fear, and without sort of misinforming people and telling them that nothing bad was going to happen. I didn't want to send that message, but I did want to send the message that we can't panic either. We can't abandon the things that give us psychological, mental health, and strength. So when local TV stations, they all became interested in, as they did throughout every state and country, what do our local scientists have to say about what's going on? And it was probably second week in March when this happened in the United States. Things started shutting down, and I started getting requests for interviews, and it was something I wasn't used to. And but my boss was like, "Oh, we should definitely engage with the community. That's part of the job." So one of the questions that they would ask, and I had a TV interview with a local TV station, and they kind of asked me at the end, what are the things you're most concerned about? And what I told them was, I really think some of our civic organizations need to not be afraid to help one another and help the community, because the community is going to need a lot of help. Older people who are high risk, nursing homes, things like that. While you can be reasonably careful, you cannot just abandon those people uh, and just out of fear. And I didn't. That message was cut out of the interview, but it was probably the most important thing that I thought that I said um, in that interview. But it was edited out, and it was more about social distancing and why we need to do it. So um, my first exposure with selective media editing was actually pretty illuminating, and I think missed my most important point.
Censorship at such an early stage for what is, to me, a very uncontentious statement. It's there's been a lot of things that have been censored that perhaps are more controversial, but that would seemingly be a very wise move.
Yeah, they didn't. I don't think they did it on purpose. I think they just, they wanted to do a story about social distancing, and they started with that premise and cut everything else out. So, but
Okay.
yeah, I mean, my worry was the fear factor of, telling people to stay away from one another. How far are you going to take that, and how long is that going to last, and how sustainable is it? And yeah, but that message didn't really get across.
Mm. So how then do we strike the balance in these cases with the kind of precautionary principle, which enables you to look at things with due care, to assess the situation and come up with the most appropriate resolution, versus this idea of safetyism, where we take more radical steps to avoid pathogens, for instance?
Yeah, right. I mean, my answer would be you allow individuals to, you give them the information, you allow them to make their own decisions about um, their own risk, and try to avoid blanket solutions, one size fits all solutions for everyone. Um, as we saw, that can benefit some groups of people and be very difficult for others to follow, and cause a lot of collateral damage.
Mm. I suppose, and I think that's something we really didn't witness during the course of the pandemic. You shared, which has been relatively well documented since very early on in the pandemic, that this is an age stratified virus, particularly when it comes to mortality. Of course, there's other variables, but we didn't have that what I would deem sound public health information. We witnessed a really politicized pandemic science. In your article, you wrote about the plagues and the unleashing of power, where you reviewed the history of how we in the West have previously dealt with pandemics. What is it that you see as the core set of problems with the archaic plague model, and why do you think that we've failed beyond that to actually include a more open set of principles?
Yeah, I mean, I think when what I've written about a lot is the politicization of science, and how we've seen in the last couple of years that uh, the process at which science is is done, is executed, really you know can be mucked up by politics, and is basically overridden by politics every time that there's a strong political influence. It's just not strong enough to stand up. And historically, that's happened before, and will continue to happen. But it's really fascinating to look at. And I think when things get political, it's very important to look before, in this case, the pandemic, and find things that were written, and see what people think about, abuse of power, and politicization of science, and um, you know what scientists said about masks when it wasn't a big deal, um, when it was only scientists talking about them, and not politicians and media outlets. And I think that's the most useful resource, is to go back in time, and um, not only the last few decades, but all the way to Middle Ages, and what's been written about those pandemics and plagues, and it is pretty fascinating, and it isn't irrelevant to what we've experienced.
Could you elaborate on that a little bit more? Tell us a bit about what that history shows us, and why this is potentially why a different approach is required.
Yeah, I mean, times when, for instance, I wrote somewhat about the early smallpox vaccination, and there was evidence that it worked, but you had to risk the infection to get it to work. It's almost like um, stimulating. It's basically stimulating natural immunity, but more of an attenuated natural immunity. And to hear the it's the community of physicians, the medical community. There was quite a few physicians strongly opposed to it, even in presence of evidence. I mean, these are experts, and the political environment was such that, people were threatened and bombs were thrown and to their houses. And in Boston in 1721, I believe, the main proponent was Cotton Mather, who was a preacher, a minister, and because he had seen the effects of variolation and how it had prevented smallpox, and the city's physicians didn't buy it. So I mean, that's an example of somebody going against the experts, and the experts not being correct. So and also the idea that you're giving someone a disease to prevent them from getting it is something that would be very difficult to sell today, and I think is relevant to our arguments about natural immunity and versus vaccination. And
Well, this is a big argument that's obviously come up over the course of the pandemic. We've seen the pandemic definition of immunity changed by the WHO. At some stage, the CDC even declared that vaccine-induced immunity to COVID is 5 times natural immunity, which not only is there a bucket load of evidence to the contrary through the Israeli study and others, we surely already knew this from influenza and other coronaviruses and respiratory diseases, that natural immunity provides a robust, in many cases, response to the virus. Why do you think this politicization of this particular issue occurred?
Yeah, I mean, it's the need to. I mean, some of it is vaccine lobbying, probably from pharmaceutical companies, but the need for politicians and leaders to be able to say that their efforts were what stopped the pandemic, what limited it, controlled it, what saved lives. They desperately want to be able to say that, and natural spread throughout the population, I think, is not something you can take credit for. And so, I mean, those are the two reasons I can think of, probably the most obvious. But they've caused a lot of problems for themselves, because now when we talk about, the evidence that shows, vaccinations don't prevent spread and they don't prevent infection, and you're comparing them to unvaccinated, you don't really know what's in that unvaccinated population anymore. You don't know how that's being defined, what the level of natural immunity is. You have some ideas, depending on where you're looking, but these things aren't considered, and it makes actually really understanding how the vaccines do work a lot more difficult, because we've completely denied that there's another route for becoming immunized.
Yes, and you're a specialist in microbiology and immunology. What's the latest science actually tell us about being exposed to a respiratory virus in this way, and some of the benefits of having natural exposure to those who are at lower risk of the pathogen?
Yeah, well, I mean, we use vaccines to mimic an infection, and it does that, and they do that at different levels of success depending on the vaccine. And one of the things that natural infection does is it gives more targeted immunity. So not only do you have immune responses, throughout your body that are similar, you also have different immune responses in your skin and different immune responses in your mucosal tissues, like your lungs and your gut. And so the route at which your body is exposed to a pathogen, if you inhale it, for instance, versus having it injected into a muscle, you're going to have a different immune response um, to those routes of exposure. And that's just, kind of basic immunology. That's why there's, people who are researching COVID vaccines by, inhalation, and much like we have the what's the flu vaccine called? It's escaping me. It's just a inhaled version of the flu vaccine, but because that's a route that mimics how we actually get infected, and that will give you memory that is more targeted to come back to your airways if you actually do experience an exposure to the pathogen. Whereas in response to a vaccine, it's still there, but it's not the same. The memory cells that are there don't have the same targeting. I mean, these cells basically have markers that allow them to return to where they were first exposed and what tissue that they were activated in relationship to. So, that's how being infected with a respiratory virus in your respiratory tract gives you strong immunity, um, respiratory immunity, as opposed to a vaccine, which still gives you some protection, but it's not quite the same.
In your assessment, if I take my mind back to 2020, I almost call it season 1 of COVID-19. You post the first lockdown in the UK, for instance, as the weather began to improve, and again, there's been all kinds of debate around the seasonal variation of the spread, transmission risk, etc. But at that stage, it appeared that as the weather began to improve, there was potentially a real opportunity to allow the virus to circulate in a lower risk environment, particularly amongst the young and healthy. In your view, if we'd taken less draconian measures, would allowing the virus to circulate, particularly within the lowest risk populations, do you think that could have accelerated the end of the pandemic if that had been able to occur?
Yeah, I mean, it could have. It's hard to say who really controlled the spread, in any sort of meaningful way, because you look at how countries that have responded. There are obviously a lot of different uh, levels of stringency that different countries have followed, and you can cherry pick and say that New Zealand and Australia, kept things at bay until there were vaccines, but then you also have Scandinavian countries which didn't do nearly what those really draconian response countries did, and they don't have that much worse of an outcome. You also have countries in like Peru, which had very, very stringent lockdown, just very awful draconian um, mitigation, and were absolutely swamped with virus. So, um, you know, it it's hard to separate what people did from just their basic geography and demography. I mean, how many old people do you have in your population? How many overweight people? How many poor people? What's the population density? And the climate. I mean, all of these things seem to have some kind of an effect, and it's very difficult to sort of tease out what individual countries did that had a very significant effect. With all of those considerations.
Yeah, I mean, the emerging data now shows that the more stringent the response was, typically the more adverse the overall impact of COVID-19 has been. But again, I acknowledge the point of those variables. It's difficult to extract the specifics, but I suppose there's an argument that the overall population resilience to the virus is potentially improved by natural exposure, but we've not been able to talk about these things in the last couple of years. That will get us, censored or smeared, or but what's your take? Is there a possibility for increased resilience if we allow natural exposure to lower risk citizens?
Yeah, eventually, I mean, when the virus is in an endemic state, it doesn't have that epidemic potential anymore, and you just have regular seasonal spikes like you do of other coronaviruses that have been around for decades, centuries, whatever. And I think we're getting to that point, and probably in some places more quickly than others. And if countries remove all their restrictions and they're not seeing major spikes, then that's probably the case. There has to be population immunity eventually, no matter what we do. And part of living in a global economy means that we're going to share viruses. I mean, it's not something we can stop. I think one of the reasons why we haven't had a major influenza outbreak that has looked like a pandemic is because we've shared influenza viruses for quite a while, and we have global immunity to a lot of the different strains just from them circulating. Whereas, if you go back to 1918, you're fairly at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and you're at a very specific point in time where you have global travel, which hadn't been something that hadn't been as fast and efficient previously. So the conditions were there for a large pandemic. If you think about it, it was pretty much the perfect storm. But because we've had increasing global transport and connection between every country, I think some of these viruses, will have enough exposure that we'll have that immunity, that these things won't spread quite the same. If we have another coronavirus, we may have more immunity from this pandemic and from other coronaviruses that will protect us, from something like this happening again. Obviously, there's always a chance that some other virus will emerge that people don't have the same level of immunity to. But I think, maintaining this sort of global economy, I think will eventually maybe settle down the chance for severe pandemics.
That's interesting to hear. Now, previously you mentioned about, we talked about the politicization of the science. You mentioned the masks debate. Now, again, you wrote an article on this, masks before and after they became political. You showed how before the pandemic, BP, that there was a realization that there was a recognition that masks were not necessarily a good intervention for transmission at scale. But this seemingly changed overnight with very minimal scientific basis. We saw a number of unsubstantiated claims, poorly designed studies, seemingly designed to kind of convince us of a new discovery. I also remember personally traveling in February 2020 when the news of the virus was beginning to circulate, and I found a document from the Civil Aviation Authority which explained how in respiratory outbreaks, the use of masks on airplanes are almost completely unnecessary. And it went down to the detail of this one particular area on the plane where there's greater throughfare of passengers, where there may be a slightly elevated risk, but the general risk was very almost negligible. Yet you can't find that paper now. It's almost disappeared from Google. Why do you think this happened around masks? Again, I know we've touched upon the politicization of science. It blows my mind that we've witnessed this, particularly within the scientific community. Why do you think the scientific community has allowed this to happen in such a way?
Yeah, well, like I said, I mean, once something this political it can override absolutely everything, and that's exactly what happened. And you can see it over a course of a couple of months, as different articles were written by various people, and some of them were critical, and you can see the response to those critical articles getting more and more hostile, and even instances where authors sort of walked back what they had written in a published journal, based on previous studies, and they would, basically disavow what they had just written, a couple of months ago, with some sort of addendum about this doesn't mean that we, are against mask mandates or anything like that. Well, but if you go back and read the original paper, there's, there's no reason to suggest what they wrote had any support for universal masking. And I saw this with several papers where they would have a little note there. They put 2-3 months later, where they were forced to kind of recant some of what they said, and that shows that really the politics of it, not because you can't have a scientific consensus. It changes over a long period of time. There's always situations where the scientific community believes something that's completely wrong, and that it takes a while to change. People are very resistant. It starts with one person, one group posting some research results that are contrary, and then everybody attacks them, and then somebody else comes up with something different that actually agrees with that, and then it's slowly, there's an argument for several years, and then eventually some people replicate the data, and there starts to become a change in the consensus. And so for this to happen overnight, it has to be politics. And you can go back and read the literature and just see exactly how it happened. The same level of evidence was interpreted completely differently, from April 2020, and by the time July came, it was a complete reversal. And science just doesn't work that way.
Yeah. So in summary, it feels like the science is much about politics as anything else. To me, this represents a worrying shift, or even a dangerous shift. What do you think needs to happen in order for the public to come to this kind of realization?
Yeah, it's a difficult balance, right? Because experts are obviously something that you want to be able to listen to, because they do know things that the public doesn't know. But you have to understand that they are also people who are subject to the same biases and pressures that everyone else is subject to. If you have someone who's studied vaccines for a long time, they're going to want to show that a new vaccine works very well. That's going to be something that will benefit them, benefit their research. And so it's not an evil conspiracy, it's human nature. And people need to be more aware of biases. And the whole mask studies that have come out in the last 2 years, you have to put that under the microscope, thinking, okay, a large portion of the population really, and scientists too, and politicians, and public health people really want us to have evidence that backs up that masks are absolutely effective and have made a huge difference. And when you're analyzing studies that have come out from the CDC or anywhere else, you have to see it through that political filter. They want to show a certain result, and that is a source of bias. There has to be even a higher bar for those studies. And you can see that many of the studies that have put out regarding masks by the CDC are actually pretty poor quality. and don't stand up to a whole lot of scrutiny. But you also have a lot of media who don't care about that and are willing to just go with the headline and the conclusion, and not ask any questions beyond that. And so this kind of makes people frustrated because they don't know what to believe, they don't know who to believe, and it's a difficult situation. You have sets of experts saying different things, and a media that will only go with one version of the story. So I share the frustration.
Yes, well, it does seem that there is organisations seeking to counter that imbalance, if you will. We recently interviewed Jeffrey Tucker on the show, founder and president of the Brownstone Institute. I understand that you're involved with Brownstone. What got you involved with Brownstone, and what do you hope to achieve by supporting Brownstone?
Well, they started reading my blog, and I believe the second post was about children specifically. I called it "Hurting Children to Protect Them," and that caught Jeffrey's eye, and he reposted it on the Brownstone website, which was pretty new at the time. I don't believe I had even heard of it. I was familiar with Jeffrey's writing when he was at AIER. He wrote an interesting article about how the pandemic response had spread among leaders of the world in a way that was almost like a virus, because everybody was sort of watching how everyone else was doing it, and then this sort of China model kind of spread among leaders because they didn't want to be left out, showing that they weren't doing something right. And so that was the first article I remember him or me reading. That he had written several before that, but that was pretty early on, and I found that it very much resonated with what I think was happening. But then he started Brownstone Institute specifically to deal with COVID issues and issues with like politicization of science, which I was very interested in, and obviously having Martin Kulldorff and Jay Bhattacharya and other people involved gave it an authenticity, I think, that has served it well. And I think the Brownstone Institute website is doing amazingly well. They've had millions and millions of visitors since July of 2021 when they started.
Yes.
So it hasn't even been a full year, and they have had quite a bit of success in getting the message out that the COVID response has had a lot of collateral damage and trade-offs that weren't acknowledged, and these are very much things that I'm interested in writing about. And I also had conversations with Jeffrey about the book, which I'm currently writing, and so he agreed with some discussion to publish that through Brownstone Institute. So yeah, I'm very much involved with what they're doing, and very much supportive of it.
Yes, well, you've been a prolific writer within your blog. It's interesting to hear the story, how that got picked up by Brownstone. Fear of the Microbial Planet. As you mentioned, you've got a book coming out by the same title. What is the key message of the book, and why do you feel that it was necessary to put this book together right now?
Yeah, I thought about it very early on. Probably April of 2020. By that, I was already thinking about writing a book, and just how people were reacting. I was really surprised how far people went. There were, even in my part of Indiana, it's not. I wouldn't say the politics aren't the same as they are in Manhattan. So. But the way people responded here, I was still really surprised by, and I would see, individuals walking around there's this couple that walks in my neighborhood, and every time they would see me, they would, be 30, 40 yards away, and they would cross the street, to get away from me. And, maybe they thought they were being polite, but obviously I was the wrong person to take it in that way, because it's completely irrational and not anything. There's absolutely nothing that would do to make anyone safer. And then, the things that my children have experienced in the schools, I've witnessed that, firsthand. I was part of a school advisory board for our local school district. They had the foresight to invite somebody like me to be on it, because they knew I would actually present a different view. So I think that was a good thing. But I was very much alone in my opinions among that group, and seeing how children were treated specifically, and why they were treated that way was really fascinating. I mean, a lot of people they would pretty much acknowledge that they knew much of this wasn't making a difference in terms of safety. It was more about the appearance of safety and how other people viewed what we were doing. I mean, I talked to one principal who I like very much, and she said, this is about perception, because parents would see someone not wearing a mask outside a teacher, and they would threaten to call the news station, and that was something that these leaders, school leaders, and they're terrified of that kind of thing. And so for them, they just wanted to avoid the trouble of being called out by small groups of hysterical but very vocal people. And of course I responded, I would very much get fired in that job, because I would totally stand up to parents and say, this is not making your children safer, and how do you know it's not hurting their development? You don't actually know that. So if you're being cautious one direction, why can't you also be cautious the other direction? And the evidence for masks being harmful isn't that strong, but neither is it for being helpful either. So if you can consider one group of weak evidence, why not consider the other, the trade-off? And these arguments didn't work very well. I did try to make them. And, the very first article I wrote for my blog, which was the mask article, was based on a presentation I had given to that group, the COVID advisory board of my school district, that my girls are in. And I decided that the information that I had in that presentation that I gave was pretty valuable, and the way that I had framed it would have made a very good article. And so that's how the Substack started, and it got a lot of attention right away, which was surprising, but it kind of steamrolled from there.
Well, I think it would have struck a chord, because at that point I think there's people who both intellectually and intuitively knew that there's something not quite right with what they're being presented. And when you get people who have a specialism in a certain field, who then come and present a different argument, it gives people an opportunity to explore from a different dynamic. So I think it's really important that people like yourself have done that type of work in order to give people that space to actually genuinely explore beyond the politicization of the science. And fascinating to hear the backstory to the blog as well as the book. But I'm caught by the title, but also the subtitle in many ways is something I'm very curious about. But how a germophobic safety culture makes us less safe. And I picked up on a quote that says that from your work, that says that people need to be exposed to, colonized by, and infected by different microbes in order to develop properly, because we're an antifragile organism, and that we need to be challenged by our environment in order to survive and thrive in it. Could you explain the concept of antifragility to us, and and what that means with respect to our immune system, and why we should perhaps not carry on with such avoidance of pathogens, or this radical disinfectation. We're still seeing people sanitizing at scale. Why some of these things may be harmful. Could you first explain what is meant by an anti-fragile system, and perhaps why we should reconsider?
Yeah, I mean, this is going back to the basics of the immune system, and it's been noted in these other books that have written about either the book Antifragile, or another book called The Coddling of the American Mind, written by Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff, which is a fantastic book. When they talk about safetyism, which is the term that they coined, they give examples of people not being challenged, and when they're talking about ideas, and people in college, we have students who are very fragile in our universities, and now they're graduating and they're taking positions in tech companies, obviously, and we're seeing the results of that not being challenged. Well, the same thing happens with the immune system, and in these books they use the immune system as the example. This is just like they say, being challenged with ideas, being challenged with things that you don't agree with. It's just like the immune system. You have to be challenged with these things in order to know how to deal with them. But now we're to the point where we flip the argument, where it's, we've forgotten the immune system, even though that was the prime example. It has to be brought up again, and I think the pandemic is a good reason to bring that message back. And the first part of the book is kind of a pre-pandemic. This is the setup. Talking about the world that we live in, and how people are not necessarily on the micro level. They're not necessarily aware of what they are exposed to, and what they're not exposed to, and how that has changed over the last 100 years, and how that's affected our health. And there's certainly trade-offs to being infected with or exposed to microbes, and being even infected with viruses. And we tend to think of viruses right now in the way that we thought of bacteria 50, 60 years ago, is where we had to destroy all bacteria. It was bad. I mean, never made a good germ. They should all be destroyed. And it's taken decades to sort of soften that and understand the trade-offs. And my argument is, we don't really know that there aren't trade-offs to viral infections too. I mean, we have a lot of viruses that we're persistently infected with, latently infected with, that we don't use. Like Epstein-Barr virus causes mononucleosis. 95% of the world is infected with, and it's recently been shown that there's a component of EBV infection which is associated with multiple sclerosis, and but that doesn't necessarily mean we should work to eliminate this virus from the entire population, because there could be a trade-off, and that's some of the things that researchers were exploring. And so I think this is a good time to sort of return to some of those ideas of the microbial world that we live in, the balance that we have with it, and how we can hurt ourselves by going too far in trying to eliminate pathogens, when it's really the world that we've evolved to live in.
Well, yes, I know the point you make there about the viruses. I know that's been well studied, certainly within the agricultural and animal kingdom, about some of the benefits of some of the viruses. I think it's right to think of it that way. It's the symbiosis of bacteria, fungi, germs, viruses. All of these things. What I witnessed is this kind of naive interventionism. We've got this idea that we need to intervene. And my experience in looking at this, not just within the pandemics, but in other areas, whether it's the climate, is that where human beings almost try to play God, if you will, and intervene in such a way, that is excessive, it seems to often come with counterproductive results. I think you mentioned the term naive interventionism. What do you think we are trying to intervene too much in public health? Do you think this is a risk to our long-term fragility?
I think the problem, a bigger problem than that is the refusal to acknowledge that there are trade-offs for every intervention. I mean, if one of the things that people, arguments that people, when they're on Twitter or attacking me or whatever, they say, are you're denying the germ theory, of when you say something like a lockdown doesn't work or social distancing doesn't work. And I completely understand the germ theory, but what I do understand is the nuance of it is that we cannot function in a way that will prevent us from being infected for a long period of time. And it's just, and individuals, and we've seen this, depending on what they do, their socioeconomic, level, they have different levels of success, and we can't hold that against people, and we can't expect people to, behave a certain way indefinitely. And, I think it's not just I think the trade-off is important, is saying, okay, we shouldn't or we should intervene. It's okay, if we do, here are the good things that can happen, and here are the bad things that can happen. And I think those opportunities were missed.
Well, I agree. I think that those trade-offs have been hugely missed. I think it's another aspect that's been politicized, because we've had this really myopic focus on cases of a virus and preventing those cases and preventing hospitalizations and deaths, but at what cost? We haven't in the children's setting, for instance, where it's been demonstrably recognized that in the vast majority of young people, the virus poses very minimal threat. It doesn't mean there's exceptions, but as a result, we've seen billions of days of education lost across the world, and there's plenty of documentation to show that lost education can impact upon their health, their mental health, their long-term prosperity, their future job prospects. It's vast, and it's not just the immediate trade-off. It's this, what I call the second and third order consequences, because you don't know what's going to happen, 12 months, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years down the line. And already now in the UK, for instance, we're witnessing this resurgence of other circulating viruses that didn't have the opportunity to circulate over those past 2 years. So things like RSV are going through the roof. We're seeing news stories every week of this breakout patterns of viruses and bacterial infections. And it doesn't take an immunologist to tell you that, the fact that we haven't allowed these things to be circulated, that it's actually caused greater vulnerability. And therefore, what are the long-term costs of that? But we don't think about that. It's this myopic focus on a very singular dimension.
Yeah, even more immediate. I mean, you can go into mental health, you can go into economic pain, and all those things are going to be real, and they're going to last years. But I mean, even you can look at vaccine uptake for childhood vaccines for diseases that are vaccine preventable or vaccine, mitigating. Those vaccinations have gone down, and leaving children vulnerable to things that are actually childhood diseases, and can actually have a higher chance of harming children, all to prevent spread of a virus that doesn't harm children, only in rare cases. And it doesn't mean that you're ignoring those rare cases, but you have to be able to understand a population level risk. I mean, if things that we do every day, we're like driving kids to school, putting them on the bus, letting them go swimming. I mean, if all of these things are so much more dangerous than exposing them to SARS-CoV-2, then we really need to ask ourselves, are these trade-offs worth it?
Well, yes, my concern, Steve, is that the absence of the trade-off analysis is certainly part of the problem, but the normalization of this cultural safetyism is a bigger concern, because that analysis, those examples you just given, all of a sudden, then what it does is, rather than make people think, well, actually, it's fine for our children to go swimming, we drop them off. It makes people think twice about the ordinary decisions they're making, where the risks are exceptionally low. And there's this almost heightened risk perception that leads to these mitigation responses in more broader settings.
Yes, absolutely. It's a cultural problem, and that's kind of how I see it. I mean, um, you can try to blame it on politicians or public health people, and there's certainly a group of leaders that have taken advantage of this and have said, okay, what is it we want, and how can we use the pandemic to get what we want? And so, I mean, that it's clear that happened on so many levels. But I think the reason that they were this whole safety culture enabled their behavior. I mean, and so that's why I do think that some people should be called out historically and how they behaved. But I'm not a conspiracy theorist, and I don't think there's some mountain layer somewhere where people are planning how to take over the world and use the pandemic to do it. But I think the problem itself is cultural. We've kind of in a world where we've seen risks mitigated to the point of where never before, and I think that causes us to focus on and sort of not understand that the trade-offs of focusing on these risks with sort of this micro laser focus. And anybody who's a parent can see this. I mean, you have a young baby at home. You're probably already thinking about how other parents think about you as a parent. I mean, there's the social pressure there. Am I doing something safe? Am I, you really have to fight it. And I think there are many different aspects. It's basically infiltrated every aspect of our life. I wrote a little bit about, dealing with daycare in my hometown, and our she might have been about 2.5. Well, she might have been 2 years old. She got hand, foot, and mouth disease, which is a virus that once it gets into a daycare, you can't get it out. It's going to spread until everybody just gets over it. And it doesn't really have a high mortality. It's pretty benign, but it makes kids miserable, and they also look bad too because they get spots on their hands and in their mouth. And but anyway, the daycare person who owns and runs ran that daycare, wanted our daughter to stay home for 2 weeks until all of her lesions were healed. And the basic biology of the virus, if you understand that, that is absolutely pointless. It doesn't make anybody safer to make a child stay home. All you're doing is hurting working parents. Because first of all, she got the virus at the daycare, which means it's circulating there. It's not going away. Daycare workers can actually spread the virus without having symptoms, because adults do that. And babies and toddlers who've had it will spread the virus in their stool for like weeks to even months afterwards. So just there's no way to avoid it. And so it was funny because I got in an argument with this daycare person, and she went to the local public health department. They actually backed her up. And our pediatrician thankfully stood up for us. Actually didn't get her anywhere, but we at least had someone who stood up for us. And I ended up going to the local health department and talking to the director about why this is completely pointless. But I think from their perspective, it didn't matter that what I was saying was true, because what they want is to show that they're committed to safety.
Yeah.
It was the appearance of it. And this happened years ago. So this is something I didn't really put together until the pandemic hit. And, it's the same thing. And at the very first interview that I had with a local newspaper, I acknowledged the fact that public health people at the local, state, federal, levels are going to have a ton of pressure to be able to deliver something that makes people feel like they have control over something, over this. And that is essentially what happened, because people demanded control over something that they couldn't have control over, and politicians were willing and leaders were willing to deliver the appearance of it rather than actual control.
Yes, I think that's been something we've witnessed throughout the pandemic. You've referenced that in this discussion, the perception of it, but I think the longer term ramifications are worrying. You call it daycare in the US, we call it nursery here. Our 8-month-old son is in nursery now twice a week. They post in the entrance hall to the nursery every form of sickness that has been through that nursery. But what you then get is you get the parents going to read this and say that there's been someone that's sneezing or they've coughed, and then they don't take their child to school that day. It's not everyone. The busy parents, got to get on with their work. But what that will lead to is then some people making decisions not to expose their children at a very young age to these circulating viruses, which again, I'm not a microbiologist, I'm not an immunologist, but I would be very concerned about the long-term consequences of that avoidance, particularly at a young age where you're actually developing that immune system. We were talking before we began this interview. My boy's just been through, that's a whole different story, but he's been through pneumonia, ear, nose and throat infection, DNV at the same time. He had 3 things all at the same time, which wiped him out. But I think that's partly due to what we've already talked about, the fact that we've got this resurgence in all of these viruses all at once because we haven't had this opportunity for them to be circulating. I think that's playing a role. But whilst it's been very hard and obviously we're very worried about him, ultimately I think he's going to benefit because he's cultivating his immune system. And I feel pleased for him that he's actually going to be stronger as a result. Yes, it's been worrying. Upsetting as a parent, seeing your child unwell, but ultimately the avoidance of illness full stop is not something that is going to be benefiting society, is it?
Yeah, it's completely a trade-off. And when you see how people have looked at this throughout history, when antibiotics were first developed, they were obviously a smashing success in World War II and helping soldiers recover from their wounds, but then they sort of became mass-produced for public use after the war. And I found articles, as I'm researching for my book, about one was like, you're going to have antibiotics in your toothpaste, and all kinds of personal products that you use. Everything is going to be basically sterilized by this ubiquitous presence of antibiotics. And it seemed like this miracle cure. It was going to end infectious disease. And now, of course, we know that there's a trade-off to that. And we're very careful about, we're supposed to be very careful about how we use antibiotics in clinical situations. So, this happens over a period of time where you have something that looks like it's miracle cure, but then you find, there's a trade-off later. I think with viruses that we're kind of in that stage now. You see a lot of people who are the building engineering people and the aerosol scientists. They're very active and very vocal on social media, and I follow a few of them. And their message is, we can engineer buildings so that they completely remove the chance of having a respiratory virus transmission, in that building. And I wrote an article about that too, because I don't see, first of all, it's possible to engineer a building that way. But the fact that there's no trade-off to that, is something that is not discussed at all, and I think it should be. But if you're somebody who's just thinking purely in terms of aerosol transmission, viruses in the air, keeping them from getting from one person to another, and you're not thinking about what happens when you're stopping that for long periods of time, you're going to think that way. So, you know, the book and the message is sort of more of a holistic look at our relationship with microbes, how it's changed, how that's been a good thing and how it's been a bad thing, and how we need to keep that a certain view, not just in the pandemic, but afterwards as well.
Mm. And when's the book coming out, Steve?
I'm about, yeah, I mean, that's always hard, right? I mean, I'd love to have it out by the end of the year. I'm about halfway done with the book. There's 2 parts to the book, and hopefully the second part will go quickly. But yeah, there's going to be a lot of revisions and things like that too. So I would like to see it done by the end of the year. We'll see.
Yes.
I'll hold me to it.
Yes, and in the meantime, for those people watching this interview, we're about solutions here on the Elevate podcast. People who have, or listening to this interview, who are concerned about this rise in cultural safetyism and want to understand what actions they can take to tackle these things. Is there any advice or insights that you could share that could help buck this trend, or at least actions that people could take individually or within their own communities to tackle this?
Yeah, I mean, it's just how you deal with your own children is a good way to start. I mean, I felt like I've had to undo a lot of what my children were told about the virus, for one thing, and other things about what their risks are for, like my daughter goes to the library by herself, rides her bike. I mean, it's the kind of thing a lot of parents would think, oh, well, something could happen, and I have to explain, especially the kids, it's very unlikely that something bad will happen, and here's why. It doesn't mean that it won't, but you can't just live your whole life trying to avoid possibilities. I think that's the easiest thing people can do, is try to raise their kids with an understanding of real understanding of risk, and not an inflated sense of danger everywhere.
Yes, I'd have to look it up, but I read a parenting book before my son was born, and I'm pretty sure they referenced the study where if our perception of risk is heightened, it actually, in some perverse way, heightens the probability of an event actually occurring, because you're actually training your brain to look for the risk, and it can actually make it more likely. I used to ride motorcycles, and the simple message was, if you don't want to ride off the road, don't look off the side of the road, because your bike tends to go where your attention flows.
Yeah.
And I've witnessed firsthand, a friend of mine had a biking accident because he was looking at the side of the road, and he literally drove straight up the side of the road. Fortunately, at low speed, he was fine, but he still broke his collarbone. So I think there is this, if all we focus on risk, that's all we experience. And I think we have to find a way to make peace with the fact that some of the things we're doing are actually creating more risk than the actual present risk that we're actually tackling. And this concept of anti-fragility, I think, is an important one for us to get our heads around, because after all, we do need to build resilience. And if we take away those opportunities to build resilience, whether it's resilience to ideas or viruses, then ultimately we become weaker as a species. And I think that's a real threat for the path that we're currently on.
I think when you talk about risk, you also have to bring back the idea of reward, because risk itself is conflated with what we used to call a hazard. Hazard is something that's always dangerous, whereas a risk, is something that could happen but also is worth doing because you're gaining something from it not happening. And, kids climbing trees and, using the monkey bars. I mean, my daughter fell from, I don't know what you call them in the UK, but we call them monkey bars. So playground equipment, where they're just climbing on, and two kids fell in the same week, and they've had it wrapped up in caution tape ever since. And one kid broke their arm, and I mean that's an unfortunate accident, but you also have to, one of the reasons that kids might be hurting themselves on this equipment is that they're not getting a chance to test their physical limitations elsewhere. And that's the benefit. That's the reward. If you're allowed to test your physical limits and learn them at a young age, you may get injured less in the future. And these are the things, that we don't seem to understand. We seem to have lost that as a culture. If you're not challenged with ideas that you disagree with, you're going to have difficulty doing that as an adult. So kids need to be, they need to experience failure. They need to understand that some, kids are better at soccer than they are, and they need to lose and win based on, their abilities or their team abilities. We've taken so much of that away. Because we're not seeing the reward in it. And I think that's something that needs to be brought back.
Thank you, Steve. Great conclusion. Now, I encourage you, our audience, you can check out the Fear of a Microbial Planet blog. It's at Stemplet74. That's STEMPLET 74.substack.com. If you're watching this, you'll find the link in the episode notes. You can also see it on the screen. If you're listening to this episode, you'll also see it in the episode description. You can click straight through to read Steve's blog. So, Steve, I want to thank you for being on the show with us today. A hugely insightful and important conversation about a multitude of issues. But really, I suppose my main takeaway is the risks, or the hazard even, of a safety culture that's emerging if we don't examine the trade-offs and the payoffs of some of those activities that we're perhaps suppressing. So I want to thank you for sharing your insights with us today. To our audience, as I mentioned, you can follow Elevate on YouTube, Rumble, Odyssey, all the major video platforms. Plus, we're now live on the audio platforms, Spotify, Apple, and all major podcast platforms. So look out Elevate with Dan Astin-Gregory to find the show. And I encourage you, please, to join our mailing list at danastingregory.com/podcast, where you'll get the latest updates on interviews like this, so you can stay fully up to date with our content. And if you want to go one step further, you can join us inside the Elevate Network, which is our private online community, where we expand on the discussion that we've had today. You can join us there at weareelevate.org. So thanks once again to Steve, and thank you to all of you who have listened and watched and shared this important broadcast. And I look forward to seeing you on our next interview on the Elevate podcast. I'll say goodbye for now, and thanks again to our guest today and our audience for sharing in this experience.